تذكر يوما كنت تعانق دمعة الفكر تناجي الله في صبر وترجو رحمة تسري فعاش القلب إخلاصا وصرت تحوم كالطير تحلق في ثقافات وتنهل من ربى الخير ترى ما زلت تذكرها وتذكر روعة.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وأصحابه وبارك وسلم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. And if you are not a follower of the Islamic faith or perhaps not very familiar with that greeting, essentially it is a universal message where we invoke the Almighty, our Creator, to send His peace and blessings upon each and every one. Welcome to this edition of Sunday Forum, coming to you from the studios based here at the Al-Quds Broadcast Complex in Gatesville, Cape Town, South Africa. The Sunday Forum, what is it all about? It's all about interesting topics, current topics, relevant topics, thought-provoking issues, and in the process we can engage and have some critical thinking among each other. What do we have on the program this evening? First of all, unlike our normal previous programs, today we have just one and not two topics, and there's a very good reason for that. The first topic is a very important one, and essentially it is about life and death. But because it's so vital, it needs to be discussed today. And in the second part of the program, we reflect upon the life and the times of a person truly who was a freedom activist who passed away just a couple of days ago. We have two great panels to discuss these issues today. First, it has become not just a topic of the day, of the week, of the month, of the year, but indeed history will record it as the topic of the century. It has affected each and every person on planet Earth, and of course I'm referring to COVID-19. Although here in South Africa, and we thank the Almighty for that, we seem to be getting out of it, but scientists have warned us repeatedly, and the words are, beware and be aware. Beware and be aware of the second wave. We all know that in Europe, countries like the UK, Paris, Madrid cities, many of them are under the threat of a lockdown again. We have literally gone through the nightmare, and the question that we need to pose tonight is, can we, in inverted commas, afford a second wave? I have with me a great panel. Dr. Sadiq Karim, Head of Operations at the Department of Health here in the Western Cape. Dr. Sadiq Karim, welcome and thank you very much for being on the program today.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. And then we have a very well-known personality, a chartered accountant. He's with a very large company in this country, and he's been associated with the financial aspect of this masjid from its inception. Mr. Hassan Kaji, very warm welcome and thank you for being here. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Sita. Thank you for having me here.
And last but certainly not least, and finally we've managed to get him into the studios here, a very busy and a very active young gentleman. He is a medical practitioner, but I prefer to call him a health activist. Dr. Zamir Bray, thank you very much, and very nice to have you here finally.
Shukran for the opportunity, looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, let us start our discussion regarding can we afford a second wave by me posing the first question to my friend Mr. Hassan Kaji. Hassan, could you share with us, maybe in the space of a minute or two, I know it's a tall order, how devastating COVID-19 has been, both on the economy and subsequently on the lives of ordinary people?
Thank you, Sita, for the question. A very good question. I don't think I can do it in 2 minutes, but I'll try my best. But basically, you must understand that even before we went into the national lockdown, people were taking precautions already. They were refraining from going to shopping centers. They were refraining from to attending gatherings, and that already had an impact on the economy because people were staying away from the shops. When we went into lockdown on the 29th, I think, of March, end of March, we were forced to stay at home. And shops were forced to close, except those that were providing essential services.
Yes.
They could trade. But the rest of us had to stay at home. Now, you know, when you stay at home and when the shops close, there's no sales. And when there's no sales, you still got your overheads to meet. In most cases, you've got your overheads to meet. But the biggest, the biggest expense in most businesses is your labor force, your staff. So you got to put your staff off. So when you put your staff off, they go with less money. Some companies pay them some salaries until a certain time, but then they have to go and claim from the UIF. But that's from the individual side, the staff side. From the business side, although a business closes down, there is a chain of supplies to supply that business. So if, for example, you're running a clothing shop, when you close your shop, the manufacturer that supplies you, they also got to cut down, and they're going to cut down their staff. And then again, that manufacturer, when he manufactures to supply his business, he's got to cut down on his suppliers. So it's a chain reaction
all the time.
So when you when you went into lockdown, all these parts of the chain of the cycle were affected. Lastly, and I mean I can talk long on this thing, but at the end of the day, it's less profits for businesses, it's less income for individuals, and I think a lot of people don't realize what's going to happen at the end. The fiscus, they depend on your taxes. So if you have lower income and lower taxes, be prepared next year. When Minister Tito, when he announces his budget, expect some serious tax hikes or even an increase in VAT even to cover the shortfall of the revenue collections.
Okay. Thank you so much. Put off an ominous picture there, but that's the reality. That's the reality. Thank you so much, Hassan Kaji. Dr. Karim, the Western Cape was at one stage the epicenter of the pandemic. How did you guys manage to bring about this great turnaround where today in the country we are looked upon as having done a great job?
Yeah, Shukran. So I think one of the, as you know, we had our first COVID patient case the 11th of March. And as most people would know, the Western Cape pandemic ran ahead of the rest of the country. So we really were the first to experience COVID in South Africa in large measure. But I think there are probably about 4 or 5 points just to focus on in the few minutes that I have.
Sure.
I think the first thing would be we rapidly instituted effective agile leadership.
Agile leadership.
Absolutely. All the way from the Premier,
Okay.
who convened the Cabinet response, Department of Health, and all other sectors of society, government and non-governmental. So I think that's quite key. And in fact, in the Department of Health, we had we followed a very militaristic structure. We had a bronze command, silver command, gold command.
Okay.
And that was the command structure that we followed. I think the second issue was that we looked around international experience and we actually really took on board what was happening or even not happening in other countries. Just one example of that, for example, was oxygen therapy was found to be very important early on in the treatment of people who now have respiratory distress. So because of that, for example, we made very sure that all our facilities have the ability to provide oxygen, whether it's the what's called field hospitals or whether it's the big hospitals or small hospitals. All our facilities were able to provide oxygen. I think that the third issue probably is that we really followed our data. It was essentially a data-led, data-driven strategy. And the fourth point was the whole health response followed those three really key initiatives, all the way from our primary care facilities to what we call the field hospitals.
Yes.
And you know, Professor Karim was on air not too long ago saying if we'd asked him in beginning of March, is it possible to build a fully fledged field hospital at the convention center, he would have said impossible, can't be done.
I saw that one.
We did that within 6 weeks. A fully fledged 862 bed facility with oxygen points right throughout, supported by a whole team of people, pharmacists, doctors, a whole range of allied therapists, social workers. So we really had a whole of government response. Obviously health was the leading was the leading sector. But the other sectors also did their part. I mean, education, for example, social development, and for example, looking around food security. Then also, lastly, I suppose, was communication with the general public. As you know, we had a very open, transparent approach. Our data was available, our response to the data was available, and people could actually just download it off the website. In fact, our public-facing dashboard won silver award recently at a very large digital award ceremony, and it had more than probably by now 1.5 million unique hits already. So the public were informed about the risks of COVID and what they can do to help prevent it. So it really was a very comprehensive strategy.
Okay, two other points I'd like to make. When you speak about data-led, you obviously, if I'm wrong, please correct me, you are saying that whatever the scientists told you, you guys paid a lot of attention to that.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really important, and it's a really important lesson that we learned. So not only did we listen to the scientists, the epidemiologists, the modeling, we also listened to the doctors around other parts of the world. So for example, I mentioned the oxygen therapy. We found that, and it was initially just tweets and individual posts coming out of New York around the importance of oxygen. So it was really, really important for us that we followed the science, and the science really helped us determine the entire response.
Okay. Second question is, before I came here, somebody called me this morning. We've got a clip, advertising clip regarding the program, and they said this is Dr. Sadiq Karim, and they want to know if there's any relation to Professor Salim Abdul Karim.
No relation, no direct relation. But I must say though that Professor Karim, and we have had Professor Karim in the province connecting with us many times.
Okay.
And I think the importance of that connectedness for the Western Cape was really quite crucial. And one of the lessons that we advised in other provinces, look, you really need to bring everybody in, from the economists to the health activists, to a whole range of people, including community people.
Okay. Dr. Samir Bray, just this week we witnessed the great fanfare with regards to the commencing of international travel, people coming into our country. From a second wave point of view, is there something that you are concerned?
I think it's an excellent question. And Siddhartha, I think we should start by just acknowledging there's more about the virus we don't know than we do know. And there's a simple fact that I was just reflecting on now as we were speaking. In the first week when travel was still allowed in South Africa, I was sitting at the NICD in Pretoria, in Joburg, and we were having this discussion with a senior scientist about is asymptomatic transmission in COVID a possibility? And at that point, there was almost general consensus, based on all of what we knew about viruses and how they work previously, that this wouldn't be a significant phenomenon. Clearly, within a matter of weeks, we were all fatally wrong, right? And the reason I'm kind of prefacing that is, I think that as we learn more about the virus, we're understanding how this virus transmits, who it affects, etc. When we look at the first cases that came out of Wuhan and where they seeded, in fact, the travel routes were victim. The European countries, North America, etc. And on our very own shores, all of the first few cases in KZN, Western Cape, and Gauteng were actually imported cases from travelers coming here. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance of travel. Right now, the world has about 35 million cases, but in very different proportions. India last night recorded 85,000 cases. These countries that are not even reporting 85 cases. And when we look at travel, we should look at what's happening in your country, and your individual risk, what happens when you travel, and then what's happening in the country where you're landing. Can they actually test? Do they have a handle on the epidemic? What's going on? And it's interesting because CDC did this phenomenal study 2 weeks ago. Fascinating. There was a lady that traveled from London to Hanoi in Vietnam. She had a very mild symptom that she didn't declare. No temperature. So she went through all the screening processes. And the map shows that in business class nogal, she infected 15 others. CDC are busy reviewing the guidelines on the risks associated with long distance travel. And in fact, I went on to CDC's website earlier, and they very specifically say,
What is CDC, if I may ask?
the Center for Disease Control, the United States, is considered kind of the authority on this guidance, that undertake travel when necessary. And so there's a really strong individual component. And in fact, when we look at this concept of the second wave, it's happening in very different ways. South Korea's second wave, South Korea had, we often look to them as the exemplars for the way they responded for their first wave. Exceptionally good testing capacity, quarantine facilities, amazing. With the second waves, they're finding that mass gatherings in nightclubs and religious institutions and travel is playing a massive role in their second wave. In Spain, they're finding that their second wave is particularly hitting the young and the asymptomatic. In the US, completely different picture, because the US, as we know, has implemented masks and social distancing in very variable ways. I mean, I won't get into the politics on this one. But what's happening is that areas that have not yet had the virus are now getting their first wave. So people are actually saying in the US, this is not the second wave. This is just a prolonged first wave. And I think that when we think about air travel, what we know is how long you're exposed to the virus, the number of exposures you have to the virus, your proximity to the person with the virus. Those are all things that increase your risk. Now, we shouldn't, and again to the council that has really driven and supported government in its decision making, has been exceptional and exemplary globally. But we should consider that there's an economic motive behind this. And each individual will need to weigh up their own need to travel versus leisure travel and other forms of travel. So I would leave it at that.
So in other words, one should be very careful and at all times make an informed decision in terms of what you want to do and where you want to go and when you want to go and so on.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hassan Kaji, can the economy, from an economist point of view, survive a second wave?
Thank you, Siddharth. First of all, I'm not an economist, I'm an accountant. But I can speak from experience. The simple answer, we can't afford a second wave. Many of the businesses that were closed when we were in level 5, level 4, level 3, now that we're level 1, they are coming back into business. You must remember that the move from level 5 eventually to level 1, it wasn't a health decision, it was an economic decision. So at the end of the day, people were allowed to go back into their business, they're allowed to open up, they're allowed to trade. But the people that were closed in the initial lockdown, a lot of them closed down completely. Some of them, especially those people or those businesses that had reserves, could close down and wait until they open up again. Not everybody was fortunate for that. Some businesses gone into business rescue, some businesses gone into liquidation. But those that survived, they are getting back onto their feet now. And they are battling to recoup the losses which they incurred in the previous levels when they were forced to close. And I think they are optimistic that we're getting into the summer months now, the weather's better, people are coming out, the virus, I understand, doesn't like heat, and they are optimistic that they can get back onto their feet and they can start being back into business and recoup the losses. So if a second wave hits us, two questions. If we go to the second wave, how is it going to affect the people going back to the shops? But more important, is government going to institute another lockdown? Once we go into another lockdown, then we're back to square one where we were.
And that's going to be a major disaster from the economic point of view. Dr. Karim, just in this week, the World Health Organization expressed their concerns about the rise in the rate of infections. I think at the start of level 1, we were at about 670, and at the moment it's just, I think it's almost double that. Are you concerned that the second wave could be a reality in South Africa?
But perhaps to pick up where Dr. Bray left off about airline travel and super spreading, what we call super spreading events. Obviously, being Western Cape, being Cape Town, given the summer months are ahead of us, that is a risk for the province. And that's how we in fact got our very first COVID case, was a patient coming from Europe obviously through the airports. So we obviously are concerned about the second wave or resurgence. What we've done from the provincial side is that we have we have about 4 or 5 key indicators that we are measuring, and we're monitoring that on a daily basis to check whether there's a resurgence of cases in the province. Okay. So for example, we keep a close eye on the number of cases, the test positivity rate, what we call test positivity rate, in other words, how many people are testing positive, how many are admitted to our hospitals, and how many deaths we have. And we monitor this on a daily basis to check whether we are heading towards a second wave. I think what we think will probably happen is that we are more likely to have mini outbreaks, if I can call them that, in areas where they've not experienced perhaps such a very big first wave. So we think that that's more than likely going to be the pattern in the province, is that we'll have these mini outbreaks in a whole number of different geographic areas. But we will have to remain vigilant about all those indicators and to determine whether there's a second wave or not. Having said that, I mean, by definition, if there's going to be roughly a 10 to 20% increase in the number of cases, in the incidence of cases, that for us is an alert level. In other words, we as a province have to be on high alert that there's something happening in that area, in that pocket, or in that community. If that increase is more than 20% above the baseline, then we will call that a resurgence. And another interesting fact to note is that, as you mentioned, Professor Karim, my namesake, one of the studies that they've done from the Ministerial Advisory Committee, they did a study of, I think it was 113 countries around the world where there's been second waves, and found that the average period between the end of the first wave and the pickup of a second wave has been 55 days. Now, obviously, that's an average. Okay. And we are going to be very vigilant, not just during the 55 days, but beyond that also in the province. So in summary, I think from our side, we probably think it's more likely that we'll have mini outbreaks. Obviously, a lot of that will depend upon behavior, our behavior. You know, whether we can keep social distancing, masks, and wash our hands and sanitize. Sure. Because if we don't do that, given the summer months that are approaching, then there's a possibility of the mini outbreaks exploding. So we need to be very vigilant, remain vigilant, and be careful.
Okay. Dr. Zamir Bray, South Africa has done relatively very well. What are the reasons for that in a minute or two?
Sure. I mean, I think that, I should start off by just saying that some of the predictions from outside Africa, made in other countries, were based on data that reflected northern experience. And that was part of the challenge. Because what we see is both a much lower number of cases and a significantly lower death rate. And alhamdulillah for both of those. But
as well as the recovery rate, which is very high?
Absolutely. And I think it's maybe useful to just talk about like what we know made a difference and what we think or have some theories about. So what we know is that the virus affects those that are elderly more severe, more death, etc., and those with comorbid disease. So a simple statistic, if you look at Africa, there's only 3% above the age of 65. Europe is 18%. 18%. So you have vastly different population pyramids. So just on that single fact could explain some of the difference. Secondly, a lot of the prediction for Africa was premised that there's a very high burden of HIV and tuberculosis, which will predispose that population to extreme high risk. Now that's true in terms of our burden. We have almost 60% of the global burden right in sub-Saharan Africa. But the risk with those infectious diseases was actually lower than chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. So that didn't really materialize as substantively, fortunately. I think the three other factors we must acknowledge. We had more time to prepare. The epidemic came to Africa last. What that meant is we had both a benefit of actually being able to prepare, but also the benefit of emerging evidence.
Yes.
So by the time we went into lockdown, within a couple of weeks, masks were made mandatory. Social distancing was recognized as an intervention, hand sanitizers, etc. And so we had the benefit of that, and we had responsive governments that took big, bold decisions quickly. Stop flights, institute non-pharmaceutical interventions, and cancel mass gatherings. Those were very significant things for African.
It was significant, it was bitter, but it was better.
And I think that if we were in a position where we had many more deaths and many more cases, we may not be criticizing governments the way we are now for saying it was too extreme. Why did you open a hospital where you never populated it? I think if patients were forced to be on the streets and not have access to care, I think we would have been much more critical, and maybe justifiably so. I think in terms of the kind of interesting theories that are floating around, and again, Prof. Mahdi has done some really interesting thinking about this. He actually says that potentially there may be, in some of the African communities, cross-immunity. So they've got immunity built up from exposure to other viruses like the common colds that are actually protecting them from severe disease. Another theory is that the genetic predisposition in our populations actually make us more tolerant to some of these viruses. Then there's a really interesting theory that herd immunity may actually be at a much lower level than, again, most epidemiologists or public health specialists would have thought for a virus of this nature. And we can unpack some of that detail, but I think the last thing just to say to Satarba is we shouldn't underestimate the vigor, the energy and the attention that government actually took this pandemic by the horns and responded.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Hassan Kaji, in conclusion, what would your advice be if we were to experience a second wave?
Well, Sitar, you understand that from a business perspective, those companies or businesses that survived were those companies that had reserves. In other words, they had resources. They didn't rely on bank overdraft. They didn't rely on outside funding. They didn't rely on extended credit from the creditors. In other words, they had reserves. Those people could survive. All they had to do is to cut their losses. They had to close down. They had to retrench people. And until we're back into business, like we are in level 1, they have the reserves now and the resources to go forward. Unfortunately, those people that did not have the reserves, in other words, those businesses that operated on overdraft and high interest bearing debt, they could not survive because those debts still had to be serviced. So at the end of the day, cash is king. So my advice to businesses is, if you've got reserves, you've got cash, and we're going into a second wave, my advice to them is preserve your cash. Don't go into expensive capital expenditure, acquiring new plant, acquiring new capital assets until we're out of the woods. Remember, I said cash is king. So if you've got the cash and you buy goods from a supplier, you must remember that supplier of yours, he is also going through the same problems due to COVID-19. So you can offer him payment sooner. You've got 30 days to pay, but Mr. Creditor, I'll pay you tomorrow. How much discount are you going to give me? Okay, cash is king.
Yeah.
The other thing also is that when you negotiate your prices to buy from the supplier, you can tell, listen here, the other customers of yours, they're going to pay you 30 days. I'm prepared to pay you today, so give me a better price.
So cash is king.
Cash is king. From an individual point of view, and I think this is important, for those people that were fortunate enough to get a salary or to still be in business during the lockdown, if we go into a second wave, the chances are that your employer may have to retrench you. The chances are that although you survive the first round of wave and you're back in business, the chances are the second wave you may not survive, which means that you, the owner of the business, will be out of income. So my advice to the individual is, don't overspend. Keep your reserves. In the event that you are going to lose your income, at least you've got income to sustain your family. Don't go on to international travel. It's unnecessary, it's unsafe, but it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
Don't spend unnecessary, don't buy expensive motor cars or go and buy your second house, whatever the case may be, because you don't know whether the second wave is going to hit us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Dr. Karim, one last question. The Spanish flu of many, many years ago, the second wave was more lethal than the first wave. Okay? In terms of deaths, would we go all out again if, heaven forbid, we are struck with a second wave in terms of once again establishing field hospitals and so on?
So yes, so as you know, we use lockdown period exceptionally effectively in this province. We established those field hospitals. We decongested our acute hospitals to prepare our beds. For example, we decongested our primary care platform by giving people chronic medication to their homes. We've delivered more than almost 700,000 parcels to people's at homes. A project that went very well in support of the Gates Foundation. And so absolutely yes. But what we've done in the province between where we are now at the period between coming off the first wave, is that we have a residual COVID response that we're keeping. So, for example, we had the convention center as a field hospital. We closed that one down because there was no more need. But we have another field hospital.
Okay.
In Brackengate, a 338-bed field hospital. So we have a reserve capacity to be able, if necessary, rapidly respond again.
So you're hoping for the best, but you're preparing for the worst.
We're hoping for the best, but we are fully prepared for the worst.
Wonderful. That's a very positive note. And then finally, Dr. Zamir Bray, maybe just in a minute or so, any positive developments in terms of a vaccine? And I'm talking about the vaccine, not necessarily before the 3rd of November.
I don't know about that vaccine. I want to get my hands on that one, but I don't know which country it's going to come from. But just to say, I think you started this discussion by saying this is a period in history that was marred by great tragedy and loss. But it should also be remembered for the greatest acceleration and innovation in mankind history. As I was looking this morning, I could not believe there are 207 vaccine candidates in the pipeline. Almost one a day since the 6-month lockdown.
Okay.
The progress in this space is unprecedented due to collaboration, due to a number of funders working together, due to governments coming together. We have 11 vaccine candidates in phase 3 clinical trials, which hopefully at least by Q2 of next year, we should have, a one that is ready to go to kind of serve the populations. And I think it's worth celebrating that South Africa is the only country in Africa where 2 vaccines are being tested.
Okay.
Because of the deep clinical expertise of that's here, the government that has been exceptionally supportive.
Wonderful.
But we should also just go into this eyes wide open. Sadly, South Africa has done a little bit of an about turn in that where vaccine hesitancy was never a problem, all of a sudden South Africa is rating as one of the worst countries from a vaccine appetite to actually take the vaccine. So it's a concern that we need to really kind of manage, and particularly in our communities, we need to make sure that it's not our communities that are going to compromise the effectiveness of a vaccine, because it relies on herd immunity. So the more of the population that's actually vaccinated, the more effective for everybody, the vaccine will ultimately be. But again, I mean, just to think about the fact that we can get a vaccine in this period will be historical.
Thank you so much. Thank you there to Dr. Sadiq Karim, as well as Mr. Hassan Kaji and Dr. Zamid Bray. Indeed, very wise counsel, very insightful, a great contribution. The bottom line is that we need to be aware and we need to be vigilant all the time so that we can, inshallah, avoid the perils of a second wave. Our next topic today, South Africa has produced many great defenders of freedom. Just a couple of days ago, we lost one such person. When we lose them, we have actually lost a part of us.
تذكر يوما كنت تعانق دمعة الفكر تناجي الله في صبر وترجو رحمة تسري فعاش القلب إخلاصا وصرت تحوم كالطير تحلق في ثقافات وتنهل من ربى الخير ترى ما زلت تذكرها وتذكر روعة.
Our next topic for today, South Africa has many great defenders of a priceless word called freedom. When we lose such people, we actually lose a part of us. This week we had the janazah of one of our dear friends, someone that has been very, very closely associated with this masjid, the late Dr. Anwar Nagya. May Almighty Allah grant him a very, very high place in the Jannah, inshallah. To discuss the person, the personality and the persona of this unique human being, we have three very eminent guests in the studio today. First and foremost, Judge Siraj Desai. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and thank you for coming.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam.
Also, Professor Yusuf Chikte, thank you so much for being here. Highly appreciated.
My pleasure.
And of course, the co-imam at Masjidul Quds, Sheikh Abdurrahman Alexander. Sheikh, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam. Shukran.
Judge Desai, if I can pose the first question to you. You knew Anwar Nagya very, very well, Al-Marhum. Give us a brief account of your relationship with him.
Thank you for that, Mr. Parker. I met Anwar for the first time in the mid-70s. That's almost 46 years old. I don't mean to give up my own age, but that's about 46 years ago. But this platform is a bit lopsided in that Prof. Yusuf and I met him at the same time. We were all friends. Yusuf and I were a group of friends, and the young man Anwar joined our group at that stage. We guided him through the early years of his life. They say this, that throughout his life was highly principled. He was principled in everything he did. He was principled in the struggle for freedom. He did not tolerate the tricameral parliament in those days. He did what he could to resist them. And even in all his business endeavors, he was highly principled. But more than anything else, if there's one thing that described Anwar best, was his total commitment to the plight of the poor. Everything he did was to uplift the vast majority of people in this country who are poor and marginalized. I don't share any of his vision. I don't share responsibility for any of his vision, but I certainly enjoyed the similar vision with Yusuf and others of that generation. Anwar was an outstanding in his early years and in later years. He was outstanding in his energy. Yet he did everything with energy and enthusiasm. As I said at the janazah, and perhaps I was misunderstood, I said, and Yusuf corrected me for that I said he was no saint. But I meant to say, if I did not communicate correctly, please forgive me. He was no saint that in the sense that he had a failing. And his failing was this, his total loyalty to his friends.
Absolutely.
He's absolutely loyal to us. And if I did something wrong, he'd defend me. But afterwards, he'd mutter, you messed up. Something to that effect. But that sort of friendship as a general aphorism, if you haven't known that sort of friend, you haven't known friendship.
Wow, wonderful. Professor Yusuf Chikhtay, the late Dr. Anwar Nagya was known for his absolute passion for the freedom of the people of Palestine. What stood out for you in that respect?
Firstly, Mr. Parker, I would like to applaud Masjidul Quds for documenting the social history of Cape Town over the years. And you know that from Masjidul Quds, there's always been a line to Al-Aqsa, which we try to formalize. And Anwar straddled those two areas like a colossus in our time. But you know, you use the word freedom, Palestine and freedom here. For Anwar, freedom was more than a word, more than the base coinage of statesmen, more than the base coinage of politicians. For him, freedom was fighting in the streets. For him, freedom was identifying and expressing a solidarity and mounting an effort and a campaign to rid the world of a virus.
A foot soldier.
He was a foot soldier, he was a street fighter, and an accomplished international artist who could understand the geopolitics and know exactly what the hidden, who pulls the strings behind the scenes. But Anwar, he learned that. His mother had a kiosk at the parade in the 1970s.
Okay.
One of the few people. And Anwar at Trafalgar, from school, he went straight to that kiosk. He went straight to that food store. And he had to relieve his mother and his sister. And in that process, he learned the life skills that he acquired, which stood him so in good stead afterwards. Of course, Judge Siraj Desai mentioned the crucible within which this took place. He doesn't claim credit for his vision, but he must be accused as one of the first accused for that kind of vision that that Anwar had. So that vision was formalized in his formative years at Trafalgar through his teachers. One of his teachers, Ernest Steenveld, the other one was Peter Parry, the other one was Hassan Pavasa, and there were many others. They inculcated him the ideas of free, equal education, freedom in our lifetime, a vision of liquidating exploitation, both here and abroad, an international vision of a struggle, that it's not a local struggle, it's an international struggle. Earlier on, we spoke about the effects of American imperialism on the activities in what we are doing over here. And Anwar grabbed that. And he could form associations and groups and cultural societies. He linked up with different organizations, and that is how we started knowing each other. He formed associations in 1976. Like Edward said, he picked up a stone and threw it. And he threw a stone against the inequalities, the inequities, the exploitation that we have in our societies. It was a similar stone was thrown, or a similar kind of act was performed by Edward Said when he said, they asked Edward Said, the famous intellectual, why did you do that? And he said, because I identify with people who stand up, who rise against the misery of people. And Anwar had those kinds of qualities in him. He recognized Palestine, and he recognized the reasons why Palestine is in the state that it is. Palestine is the policeman of American and global imperialism, British imperialism, American imperialism, to plunder the resources of the Middle East. We've seen how they've destroyed it, how they destroyed Libya, Syria, they in Yemen. But the point that he made about Palestine was Palestine is affected by two viruses. One, the Zionist virus, and the other one, the current virus. And you had a lecture earlier on about the resurgence. And the resurgence of that virus is the way in which Trump and his associates are dragooning the United Arab Emirates, the Saudi Kingdom, into an effort to normalize that which is so abnormal in that part of the world. So that is, if you ask who Anwar was, then he I said it earlier. It is our Nakba that Anwar passed away. It's a
Catastrophe.
personal tragedy.
Catastrophe.
It's a catastrophe for us. But in that Nakba, we must rededicate ourselves in that we won't surrender.
Inshallah.
Like those persons, and this is a mosque in which we are in, and you have a very honorable audience, so we won't use those words that we normally use.
I understand.
Shukran.
I understand. Before I go to our co-imam, I just want to make 2 points. The first is that the struggle of the people of Palestine is dear to everybody, but this masjid took a principled position many, many years ago that the flags of Palestine will be flying on the roof half-mast until the day comes when the people of Palestine get genuine independence.
Amen.
That's the first point. And before I go to Sheikh Abdul Rahman, I just want to also mention that over the 32-year history of this masjid, we've done certain things, and I say this in all humility, but the greatest gathering that this masjid ever had, the greatest gathering, was to be able to have over 3 days 42,000 people assembling at this masjid. And the late Al-Marhum Anwar Nagya was responsible for that when we had the Islamic relics here about a year ago. Sheikh Abdul Rahman, the next question to you. You were very close to Dr. Anwar Nagya. What was your relationship with him at a spiritual level?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First and foremost, Hamare Janab Satar Parker, Shukran, and I thank Almighty Allah for this honor to share this platform with this very distinguished panel here, the Honorable Judge Siraj Desai and the Honorable Professor Yusuf Chikte. Shukran for being here with us today.
Just say, Maulana, it's our privilege to share the platform with you.
Alhamdulillah, speaking of a man of the caliber of Anwar Nagya, a person whom I've known now for 20 years, since I was Imam at the Bridgetown Masjid, we worked very closely together. And we have just lost him not even less than a week, but already you can feel the vacuum that he left behind. The vacuum in the sense how involved the man was in social upliftment, standing for justice, championing the Palestinian cause. And of course, Anwar Bhai, and I used to call him sometimes very affectionately when I see him, I said, Anwar Bhai, and he would giggle, he used to love the way I just addressed him. And Anwar Bhai, or Anwar Nagya, was a great friend of Masjidul Quds, as you yourself know. We've had him here for about 2 or 3 Jummahs already, and we also had him the Palestinian Al-Quds Day, where you were present, Amara Janab Satar, and Siraj Parker were present when we received Brother Anwar here on our Friday Nasiha program.
Yes.
So he was very close with us. He was a friend of the MJC, a friend of the ulama, and I always describe him as a very no-nonsense guy. Even if you're his friend, he'll put you in check if you are wrong, if you step out of bounds. So yes, this is the man that we will miss. And though, as I said also the day of his janazah, I said we are bidding farewell physically to our friend Anwar Nagya, but he will live on forever in our minds,
Absolutely.
in our memories and our du'as. And I say it is so significant for me to say also and to add that at the same time, while we celebrate and commemorate the martyrdom of Imam al-Shaheed, Imam Abdullah Harun, at the same time, Allah took him away. As if to show us that Allah is giving him the level of martyrdom because the sickness that he succumbed to grants you martyrdom and shaheed.
Thank you so much, Judge Desai. Anwar Nagya was involved in many aspects of life. Among them was the whole issue of the redevelopment of District 6. You have some knowledge of that?
District 6 was central to his life.
Okay.
From the 70s onwards until today. He was in the early years, there were many attempts to develop the land for private developers, the city, and even in 1994 the new government wanted to develop it for other purposes, give the land to private developers. Anwar opposed that, and his vision was that there must be a community back in District 6. And together we resisted the development or the redevelopment of that area. Our battle was a bit difficult in that 1/3 of the land was taken away by the Cape Technicon. There was 2/3 left over for development. the recent court case, which Anwar actually opposed, where the government was ordered to develop 2,000 houses. That doesn't solve the problem. It simply means 2,000 people come in, and the rest of the land, what happens to the rest of the land? And Anwar suspected, and I think he had reason to suspect, that there were developers hovering in the background, wanted to exploit the situation.
Okay.
It is prime land for development, for private development. And that meant that our vision of a community returning to the center of town would not be fulfilled. I don't think even the government has bought into that yet. But that was the campaign that he fought. And I'm saying so without breaching privilege, that his last call to me from his hospital bed was to the effect that don't listen to so and so and so, this is just do this. And he tried to communicate to me who to see and how it is to be done. So I'm left.
Is that in connection with District 6?
District 6. Our last conversation
Okay.
was to do with District 6. When he first got into hospital, he was still making calls before the operation took place. After he got operated, and then he got COVID, and then he passed on. So one of the last call he made to me was to do with that. I just want to say one thing that Yusuf raised about Anwar's beginnings in the stall on parade. Much is made of him being a philanthropist now, but for the greater part of his life, he was an ordinary working man, and he did so with the help of all of us, and he did so with great dignity. He pulled himself up with imagination and with his own aplomb to what he achieved. He was a self-made person in many senses of the word. I don't want to be unduly emotional, but when we, Yusuf and myself and others, we were a very close set of friends in the 70s and the early 80s, when Anwar was part of that circle. And for the next 40 years, all of us have remained friends, although we've branched off into different spheres of activity. One of them is Usi Shabuddin, who now heads the Bukab Civic Association. Other Bash Wagley was the Labour Court. But one of our friends then sent an SMS to us and said simply this: with Anwar's passing, a bit of each one of us has died. You know, that may be emotional, but it struck me. I paused to reply, but
I can imagine.
It shows the level of friendship and loyalty which he generated and which he encountered from all of us. I'm proud to have been part of that generation. I'm sure Yusuf is proud to have been part of that generation. And our generation, with Anwar and with its inspiration, will continue to play a role in the redevelopment of this society.
Yusuf Bhai, when one witnesses today the current international trends, as you mentioned earlier on, establishment of diplomatic ties with Israel and all the political shenanigans that's taking place at the moment, when you were in contact with the late Dr. Anwar Nagya, in terms of this very recent development, would you say that at any stage he lost hope for the people of Palestine?
No, never, none at all. In fact, he's a courageous activist, not only a courageous activist, but he always had a revolutionary optimism. And the more things clarified, and in his mind, there's a new portal opening up for us to re-engage and recommit and rededicate and rearm ourselves. And he did that. He rearmed a new generation to fight on a new front, on a new battle at a new time. And that's what he did. And the difference between Anwar and many others, I mean, we all do charity, for instance, we all do humanitarian work, we all engage in social activism, but he redefined charity. You could see the limitations of NGOs, of charitable acts, and he could link it to an international order. You could link, for instance, the poverty and the distribution of food with monopoly capital. He explained to me how there are 5 groups in here in South Africa controlling the food market, and how we must tackle that, unbundle that if we want to get anywhere, because that is the cause of our poverty, the obscene accumulation of money because of the conquest, the colonial conquest that they've had.
So I take it that there was a strong socialist undertone as well?
Enver had, his mother called him Enver.
Okay.
Enver had a strong egalitarian streak.
Okay.
Enver
Include an ism.
yes, he had a strong streak. He was very determined to abolish, to tackle, to combat inequality globally and within countries. And that is his, and whether it was in water distribution, in the drought period, he played that kind of role. Now in the COVID period, the distribution of personal protective equipment and masks, he could tell me, he said, Yusuf, this thing is controlled, the clothing industry, the rubber bands, and all these things are controlled by certain little groups, and we must break that monopoly. And he provided opportunities for local businesses, for entrepreneurs, for women in the townships to engage in a way where they benefit from this kind of thing. So he engaged in that. Yes, there's no doubt that the primary focus of his political outlook and his vision was to liquidate exploitation. Okay. So he experienced that in his workplace at Puma. And what did he do? He provided generously in the educational upliftment of workers and skills development for them to escape that. Judge Siraj mentioned about where he comes from, but you know, whether he was in poverty or in less or in more fortunate circumstances, you couldn't contain Anwar. You couldn't contain, because that was his persona. He was always a person who had a presence, who had an international presence.
He was passion-driven.
He was passion-driven, but he had a presence larger than the persons around him. And that is what drove him, and that is what people admired about him. But I want to come back to the question, what is it that enabled him to have that kind of vision? It was his teachers. And he belonged and he formed cultural societies, educational societies in the 1970s, in the 1980s. He formed civic associations to provide a platform for ideas to be discussed and for his vision to be tested and tried, and which and to bring around people towards that kind of vision. And he did it theoretically and at a practical kind of level. He could mobilize people. Sheikh mentioned about how he was involved with Masjidul Quds and the MJC. The remarkable thing about Anwar was he drew different strands of a divided community into a single flood.
For a common good.
For a common good. And that was so remarkable about him. But I want to come back to this establishment of cultural societies, of social clubs, of a film club he had. And he showed one film, he was part of the Alpha Film Circle, and he formed the Cape Town Cultural Society as well. There they showed films about the Algerian Revolution and Jamila Boupacha in his youth. You know, and many other things. So these became fora for discussions, for our ideas to be expressed and articulated and clarified, so that we feel armed when he used to go into the trenches to battle in Palestine and in District 6.
Sheikh Abdul Rahman, within a minute or so, what made him such a strong spiritual person as well? Besides what we've heard about the revolutionary angle in terms of exploitation of poor people, but also a spiritual man.
I think it's first and foremost his stance for justice in general, and also his respect that he had for every denomination and religion, to such an extent that if you go to the museum, you'll have a special quarters for the Christian church and a floor for the Jewish synagogue, as well as for the masjid. And just recently when I went to join him on dishing out the 1 million masks to people at the museum, we made the azan upstairs, and myself and him were alone making dua, and the man was crying. The man was crying, and he said, we need the spirituality in our lives. And I've also seen this when he brought the relics of the Prophet ﷺ. He cried when we were talking, and he said to me, no, all the people can't afford to go and visit the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina.
I remember that.
Let us bring the Prophet's relics here.
I remember
And
that.
I said to him, I will bring it up with the masjid committee. The first one I spoke to was your honorable self, and immediately we said Bismillah, and what a resounding success
Absolutely.
we had. Alhamdulillah.
Judge Desai, just in conclusion, maybe in a minute or so, if you could elaborate on the challenges that he had and the way forward in terms of bringing the Palestinian Museum to finality.
We say the challenges that he had, simply this, that not everybody had the same passion that he had.
Yes.
When he seized on something, he seized on it. I know him from his early days in the Civic. I chaired the Civic, and he was our organizing secretary for 10 years. And he seized on housing then. And housing was his passion for the 10 years. Well, it logically extended itself to the dislocation of the Palestinian people. The museum itself was funded by him.
Yes.
And he dies a bit prematurely in that it's not complete yet. We are now confronted with the task of completing his various projects. His battle for Palestine, we all share that passion, and we all will continue that battle the best we can. The completion of the museum will be a bit more difficult task. We're planning to meet as his friends and others and people who knew him and see what we could do. What we hope to establish is a foundation in his name, but we'll debate that in the weeks to come.
Okay.
But besides the formal things, Sheikh Yusuf, I think what we do when a soldier falls, we pick up his spear.
Yes.
And for me personally, it'll just be the continuation of the task which we did together, and to find other young people to pursue that task.
Judge Desai, let me say that the Palestinian Museum is an important landmark in the history of Cape Town. And if there's anything that can be done on the part of this organization, Sheikh Abdul Rahman and the Masjidul Quds committee, please just give us a call, and we'd like to be part of that.
Inshallah, we shall certainly call on you. Let me see. Of course, we have to speak to his family about that.
Sure, absolutely.
The family is the Calf Trust is Kamil, Anwar, Amal, and
Fadila.
Fadila, yeah, his wife and 2 children, and they will have the decisive say. But they obviously will cooperate with all of us in implementing that. I think we must find a way of continuing the vision that he had for that museum. Not simply, it wasn't simply a museum for Palestine, but to cultural improvement as well of the community, a cultural center, as he envisaged.
Gentlemen, just before we bring the curtains down on this very interesting topic that we have today, I'd like to ask the 3 of you a common question. What lessons of this great man's legacy should we emulate?
Well, we spoke about Anwar, and Sheikh also spoke about a part of his. In Cape Town, many people go for Hajj over the years. When they stand in front of the Kaaba, and Sheikh is teach this to us all the time, they ask for amongst our ranks, let there be somebody born from our children. And Anwar is the gift from the heavens to us. He's a gift, he's a special gift, he's such a special gift. And one of the things that Sheikh Amin always said to us, we are men and we are rough diamonds.
Sheikh Amin Fakir?
Sheikh Amin Fakir, yeah. We are men and we are rough diamonds. And it takes a woman to polish us up. and we know Anwar as a little bit of a rough diamond in the 1980s and so on. And I want to acknowledge Fadila, who in her own right is a great humanitarian.
Absolutely.
A great who stood by his side through thick and thin, through factory and finance capital. And with humility, she prosecutes the ideas and the vision of Anwar still. So for me, what is that we take away is Anwar, Siraj mentioned this some time ago, Judge Desai mentioned this some time ago. Anwar had a way of coming into the family and making himself part of the extended family. He was a Desai, he was a Chikta, he was an Abrams, he was a Parker, he was a Janab, he was everything. and that was a unique quality. So that building up of a social cohesion, of a solidarity, of bringing people together, of a unifier, of a role model, of an exceptional, inspiring mentor. That is the kind of thing that I take from him. Thank you.
I'm not sure what I can emulate from his life. He has so much passion for the causes he took up. I don't think I'm young enough to do that still. But I think what he did was to inspire people around him. And that's what we should try to do. Encourage a new cadre of people to think like he did, like many of us do today. Because there's a diminishing level of understanding what society is all about.
He was a great mobilizer.
He was a great mobilizer. And I think we could do that. And we could encourage others to join us in living the life he led. And also advocating the causes he advocated.
Sheikh, on your side?
I must say that Al-Hajj Dr. Anwar Nagya leaves behind giant boots. And the thing that stands out for me is I've seen how he interacted with people, young and old, rich and poor, male and female. When he speaks to you, you believe that you're his best friend. You believe that you're his favorite friend. And that is something that I would like to get into me, to treat everyone with love, mercy, and compassion.
Sheikh, you do that very well.
Thank you so much there to Judge Siraj Desai, Professor Yusuf Chikte, and Sheikh Abdul Rahman Alexander, the co-imam at the masjid here, with such an interesting aspect on the life of Dr. Anwar Nagya, who passed away a couple of days ago. Collectively, we make dua to the Almighty that He must grant him a very, very high place in the Jannah, inshallah. Before I go, just to mention to you that our next program in 2 weeks' time, inshallah, we have again two very, very important and great topics. The first one is the Mail and Guardian newspaper has done a survey, and they've identified 200 very, very influential young people in our country. Dr. Syed Parker will be hosting that particular segment of the program. He's identified 3 such people, and that should be a very interesting program to watch. The second program that we'll be having in 2 weeks' time, again a very interesting topic: are our youth disconnected from religion? If so, and why? Are our youth disconnected from religion? If so, and why? Don't forget, 2 weeks' time, that's going to take place. Before we go, thank you so much to Siraj Parker, Samir Parker, Anwar Umar Rumane, Brother JJ Abdul Rahman, Brother Ishtiaq Badruddin, and Hafiz Bilal Mahdi for doing all the technical duty today. Special thanks to all the participants on today's program. A note of appreciation to Roses for the beautiful stage decor and Nisa Gaby for the artwork. Until we meet in 2 weeks' time, inshallah, we bid you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
तेरे आने की आस है दोस्त, शाम फिर क्यों उदास है दोस्त। महकी महकी फिजा ये कहती है, तू कहीं आस पास है दोस्त, तू कहीं आस पास है दोस्त।
تذكر يوما كنت تعانق دمعة الفكر، تناجي الله في صبر وترجو رحمة تسري، فعاش القلب إخلاصا وصرت تحوم كالطير، تحلق في ثقافات وتنهل من ربى الخير، ترى ما زلت